In this lesson, you will learn how to factor by grouping. You must have 4 terms in order to factor by grouping. In a previous lesson, you should have learned how to factor a greatest common factor from a polynomial. In this lesson, you will learn to group terms, putting 2 in each group, and factor the greatest common factor from each group. The leftovers after factoring out that greatest common factor for each group will be the same. So let's look at our first example. We have 7x squared plus 28x plus 6x plus 4. So because we're factored by grouping, we're going to group the first 2 terms together, and we're going to group the last 2 terms together. Notice we are not simplifying anything. Yes, I see that the middle terms are like terms, and you typically, when simplifying, could add those together. However, we are not simplifying here. We are factoring, finding what multiplies together to equal this problem. So in our first group, we have a 7x squared and a 28x. So we'll come over here to the side and do our prime factorization. I prefer looking for the variable first, so I see that at x squared and x to the first, my smallest exponent is just x to the first. I can factor that out. So we'll have a 7x for our first term and just a 28 after we factor out that x. Now I like to look for my number after looking for a variable. So my number that will divide into both 7 and 28 is 7. 7 goes into 7 one time, and 7 goes in 28 4 times. So that is our leftovers, x plus 4. You are not required to have the 1 in front of that x. So let's do the second group, the 6x plus 24. Again, come over to the side and do your prime factorization. First, look for a variable. 6x and 24 do not have a variable in common. Only the first term has a variable. The second term does not have a variable. So we'll start with our numbers. 2 is a prime number that can go into both. 2 goes into 6x 3 times, and then of course bring down your variable. 2 goes into 24 12 times. We continue to divide by primes, again knowing that our leftovers should match. We know we can't stop here anyways. So 3 and 12 are both divisible by 3. 3 goes into itself 1 time. 3 goes into 12 4 times. So again, we can simplify, and that's really just x plus 4. And so this is how you know you are factoring correctly, is when your leftovers match. So for the first group, we take our GCF, 7x, and write it in front of the parentheses. The second group, we write again our GCF, so 2 times 3 is 6, and again in front of the parentheses. And our leftovers, x plus 4, is what goes inside each of those parentheses. These parentheses should always match. So our final answer is to be written as 2 sets of parentheses. You can start by doing your GCF, the 7x and 6, in one parentheses, and then the ones that match come together as the other parentheses. It would also be acceptable to write x plus 4 times 7x plus 6. Because multiplication is commutative, either answer is correct. So if you want to put your GCFs together first and then your leftover that match, or you can think about factoring out that leftover parentheses to the front, and then your leftovers are 7x plus 6 here for the other parentheses. Let's look at another example, number 2. Here we have 2x squared minus 9x minus 6x plus 27. So again, we can factor this by grouping because it has 4 terms. So group the first 2 terms and group the last 2 terms. Because the second group starts with a negative, we must factor out that negative. This is a special case. So anytime the first term of a group has a negative, So this second group has a negative. If the first term of the group has a negative, you must factor out the negative, and we'll go through the steps to do that. So let's do the first group, the 2x squared minus 9x, and then we'll talk about how to do the negative in the second group. So here over to the side, do your prime factorization. We have 2x squared minus 9x. Again, always look for your variable first. That way you don't forget to factor out that variable. So x squared, x to the first, they do have an x in common. When you go through your steps of factoring out that variable x, be very careful that you actually factor it out. Sometimes I see students writing 2x squared. They keep it squared. Well, then that means you really didn't take the step of factoring out an x. If you're going to factor out an x, it becomes 2x to the first. So make that a 1 if you need to show that. Minus, of course, if we're factoring out an x here, it's going to bring down just the 9. After looking at your variables, see if you have a number. So 2 and 9 do not have anything in common. 2 is prime, so of course it can go in itself, but 2 cannot go into 9 evenly. So we are going to stop here. So in the second group, we have negative 6x plus 27. We're going to factor out the negative first. So in order to do that, you just do a negative 1, and that way it can take care of that sign right away. So if I factor out a negative, that makes the negative 6x, it makes it become positive. And if I factor out a negative from a positive 27, it makes it become negative. So pretty much just think about when factoring out a negative, it makes each of your terms opposite of what they started. Which if you'll remember, because our leftovers have to match, notice now we have our signs fixed where they are both going to match as far as positive or negative. Our numbers are still not quite there, but we will get that after doing our prime factorization. So let's continue on with the prime factorization. We're going to start with dividing by 2 wouldn't work. Let's try a 3. 3 goes into 6 and into 27. 3 goes into 6 2 times. 3 goes into 27 9 times. And look, we're there at our leftovers matching. So our GCF for that group is a negative 3 that we'll factor out. So let's write that in our answer. Here for the first group, it's a x. So factor that out to the front. And then your leftover parentheses. Go ahead and write in the 2x minus 9 if you would like to then. I like to come back after getting my GCF parentheses and everything set out. So our GCF goes up front, and then our leftover parentheses. Don't forget your negative. So negative 1 times 3 makes it negative 3. That's what we factored out. And then again, our leftover will go inside the parentheses. So 2x minus 9 and 2x minus 9. Be sure to write your answer in the 2 sets of parentheses. That's the complete factored form. So one parentheses is x minus 3, where you bring those GCFs together and make one factor as x minus 3. And the other parentheses is the 2x minus 9. That is the complete factored form. Always feel free to check your answers. You could take this x and distribute it back through the 2x minus 9 and take this negative 3 and again distribute it back through this 2x minus 9, and you should end up with what you originally started with. That's always a good way to check, especially when we start having positive and negatives in our problem. And that way you can make sure everything is correctly written in your answer. Let's look at one final problem, number 3. Here we have 15x squared plus 30x minus x minus 2. So again, factor by grouping. It has 4 terms, so we can group the first 2 and group the last 2 terms. Notice the negative here, so we'll factor that out. In the first group, let's find its common factors of 15x squared plus 30x. We start with the variable. So 15x plus 30 is what's going to be left over after factoring out that variable. Then do your numbers. A 5 will go into both. 5 goes into 15 3 times. 5 goes into 30 6 times. And continue dividing by primes until you no longer can, so we can divide by 3. 3 goes in 3 one time, 3 goes in a 6 2 times, so our leftovers for this group is x plus 2. So let's do the second group, the negative x minus 2. So we just talked about the fact that we have to factor out a negative because that first term is negative. We have to factor out the negative. So that's going to make both of these terms opposite of what they started. So it started as a negative x, it becomes positive x. It started as a negative 2, it becomes positive 2. So there's no other common factors for this group. The only thing they had in common is that negative 1, and that is fine. That is okay to have just a negative 1 factored out. And then also, you can feel kind of confident that you're on the right track because our leftovers do match. So always go back and maybe check your previous work if you're unsure if this is all you needed to do. Because you know that they need to match, don't ever force them to match by making them just writing down whatever you see. But actually check over your math work, and if they're matching, then you can feel confident that you're on the right track. So for our first group, we multiply together our x times 5 times 3 to get our GCF of 15x. And then we have our leftover parentheses. For our second group, we factored out a negative 1, and yes, you need to show that negative 1. It is important to show that number in that case. A lot of times in math, 1s are an understood number, but in this place, it's a value that you need as a placeholder kind of term there. So the leftover parentheses, of course, will go after that. Put your x plus 2's in each of those parentheses. And because they match, they can come together and make one parentheses x plus 2. And then the 15 minus 1. That's why, again, this minus 1 is important. So you can show 15x minus 1. You can show those together in one parenthesis. So that is the correct factored form. So I mentioned it in the last problem, but I'm going to go ahead and show you in this problem how you can check. So if this is our factored answer, in order to check, just distribute it back together. So set up your problem, x times 15x minus 1, and then the 2 times, again, the 15x minus 1. X times 15x is 15x squared. X times negative 1 is negative 1x. 2 times 15x is 30x, and 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. So go back to your original problem. We have the 15x squared. The next term was originally 30x, but notice you have that in your answer. Addition and multiplication is commutative. So because we wrote our parentheses in this order, that's why our answer came out in this order. We could have flipped those parentheses around and it would have flipped these terms around. So as long as they still show up somewhere in your answer, it is checking out. Because notice we have the negative 1x, and then the minus 2. So that does check if you distribute it back together.